Hey y'all, and welcome to my latest video. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be taking an old mini that I painted and trying to revive it for use in a totally different game, or a totally different setting. This here is Smo the Executioner from Dark Souls, the other half to Dragon Slayer Ornstein. For me, Smo was always my favorite design. Ornstein looked cool, but Smo was terrifying and intimidating, and not just because of his size, but also because of how incredibly unsettling his armor was, particularly the helmet. His really insane sounding laugh is still stuck in my head, and I'm sure for a few people watching, the moment they saw this big golden lad, some drums, a loud choir, and a harp started playing in their head. Definitely a very memorable boss theme. I painted this back in 2016, and the paint job was fine for a board game mini, I thought, or at least to my standards, but I wanted to use him for something else, and a rule set came across my path that I thought he would fit really well for, but then also something else in the future. So this was the general idea I went with. I was going to use these styrofoam balls again to create a new head for the hammer, because the old head was way too heavy, and you could see how soft this plastic is. It actually bent it out of shape. Another idea I had was to use the cage like this, fill it with body parts, and have Smo essentially just swing a whole cage full of corpses. I guess the thinking was that he would drop the hammer on you and you'd get crushed in there and join that mass. I don't know, it's horrifying to think about. This is what I was going to use, this whole big pile of zombies and creatures and stuff. And I had them at hand, ready to go. I was going to cut off their arms and stick them through the grating. And I thought it was such a great idea, but I came across some artwork by Mike Francina for an upcoming game called Trench Crusade. He'd drawn a really, really gnarly, what he called a Sin Eater. And I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm into. Another idea that I had was to wrap this in the same bramble I used in a previous video to make it look like it was a thorny bush at the end of this hammer. So you'd be turned into a fine red mist by a petrified bush of thorns. So as you can see, this plastic is pretty soft, and I was trying to come up with different materials that I could use to replace it, and I had intended to go all the way and replace that shaft from one end to the other. Then I pulled out this pen, and I wanted to see how effective that would be. So after taking off the cap and fitting it on the handle of the hammer, I realized it was entirely too big, more like a sleeve, but I wasn't ready to abandon the idea because I think the size would have fit really well with the hammer. So now I'm working on the skirt, and what I'm laying on here is just super glue and some pieces of Gale Force 9 chain that I had pre-cut using my heavy-duty wire cutters. I used those because I didn't want to fight this thing with smaller wire cutters or sprue cutters. They do fine for cutting through metal, but I didn't want to have to wrestle this thing and kind of break it apart in some places. So I just used my wire cutter. I'm using my tweezers to get it into place, mainly because it makes it easier. I kind of just lay one end and then double it back over and lay it down again. But also, as long as you work pretty quickly, it's better than using your fingers, I found, because if you're using tweezers, you have a smaller contact patch and you're not sitting there long enough for it to bond to the glue. So you don't get super glue all over your hands, and you don't damage your model trying to rip your hands away from the super glue. Now some further adornment. A bunch of skulls from a box of skulls. This is really inelegant. I use a lot of super glue, and I just kind of put these skulls wherever they need to go. It's off camera a bit, but I use a small aluminum, I don't know what you would call it. This kind of little trays for mixing paints in, for airbrushes or oil, and that's just so stuff doesn't get lost on my cutting mat and doesn't roll off anywhere. I know exactly where it is, and it's easy to find. Not laying these any specific way. I mainly just want them to cover up this middle shape, and I thought about just ripping it off, but it's stuck in there pretty good. So I'm just going to cover it up as much as I can using these cut pieces of chain to simulate chainmail and the skulls in the middle of the skirt. And I would urge you to check out the artwork for Trench Crusade on social media. Really wild stuff on there. And the Soul Eater was the first one that I thought I could really get into and make pretty easily. I felt like I had the exact right finisher for it. But he's also going to fit well in something like Necropolis or The Doomed, which I'm also really excited about. So I'd say 5 skulls is about right. You know, if your armored skirt has less than 5 skulls, then, you know, you're just not intimidating enough, I think. I'm not too worried about being really neat with the glue. If anything, I use it in places to reinforce what I've already put down and seal it further, so I'm not worried about any overrun, really. Because the original skirt was like a really thick plate, I wanted to cover it up with more chains, not just on the top face that would be looking at you, but also along the thickness of the plate. That gives it more depth. Now, while I'm covering up some of these parts of the original design, there's other parts I did not want to cover up. For instance, you could see the design on the thigh here, kind of like filigree engraved into the thighs. I really like the look of that and how it pairs up next to the skulls. You know, that little bit of beauty next to something really, really grim and terrifying. Really cool idea, and I wanted to preserve that. So not only did I do all the back, of course, I put a little piece of chain in between the skulls as well to help break it up just a little bit. I also wrapped it around his wrist, just because I thought it would look cool and to differentiate one wrist from the other. So here's a couple things that I tried to use. I had this clear acrylic rod, which looked like it was about the right size. This chopstick that I use for priming stuff might be a little too large. And this brass rod that would have absolutely been great, but it was just a little too small. And I'm just remembering now that I have a micrometer at hand, so I could have used that to get the actual thicknesses of these materials. The pen, of course, is only good as a sleeve, but I took apart the rest and I found this bit here at the point of the pen, and the diameter of the clear acrylic rod works really well here. So I figure, why not put this fluted looking end against the grip and then put the hammerhead at the other end to break up the design on the shaft some. So here we go. Can't turn back from this. Clean off the cut as best as I could and use the pin vise to make a hole to where I could pin the components together using some brass rod that I had. I really didn't want to mess with a surface-to-surface contact. I really needed that pin in there to make sure it stayed in one spot to reinforce it some more. I did drill into the clear acrylic, which is something I'll never do again just because it took forever. But once I got a pretty decent length, I fitted the piece that I needed and took a look at what the end result might be. Trimmed a little more off, added maybe too much super glue, and fitted everything together one last time. Now actually, because the pin was a little off center, I'm able to rotate the blue section there to get it right where I really needed it. So my terrible inaccuracy with the pin vise actually helped this time. So now I've got this hammerhead and I don't know what to do with it. And I briefly thought, hey, this might actually work. But I really wanted to use that head, so I decided to skip that. So now I've got a pretty good base to work off of. I can see it coming together in my head, and this is what one half of the mace head looks like. And I gotta give a shout out to someone who commented on the community post that I shared. They said it looked like a plunger, and in retrospect, I really wish I had magnetized this because having a plunger at one end would have been hilarious. I would have loved to have had that on the battlefield. So I'm gonna break out a compass. And I would have liked to use this template, but you're going to see why it's not going to work for me. So I measured out a radius that's more than the radius of the ball. The reason being is because I want to cut saw blades. So I need the actual circles to be larger than the diameter of the hammerhead. So I actually have, serrated edges sticking out of the ball. So this is pretty thick plastic card. It's not quite as thick as a credit card, I'd say, but it's not as thick as a sheet of paper, which is what I tried first, but I didn't think it was going to be sturdy enough, so I upgraded to something thicker. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what the thickness was, but you can kind of get an idea here of just how sturdy this was, but not so sturdy that I couldn't cut through it easily with a pair of heavy-duty scissors. And rather than mess with the compass 2 more times, I just used them as a template and cut 2 more. So first I was drawing out my radius from the center, and then I realized, hey, I have something I could use as a straight edge. Why don't I just use that? So I just drew a line through the middle, trying to get as straight through the middle as I possibly could. I didn't have any idea in mind exactly how many sections I wanted on this pizza, so I just did what felt right. 2 of these circles have more sections than the other, so I'm going to stack these to where the one with the bigger teeth is going to go in the center. Now, to what I was talking earlier, the diameter on these circles is a little larger than the diameter of the styrofoam ball. So I'm going to pick a point, just kind of eyeballing here, but I'm going to pick a point that is at about 1 inch, and go from there to where those lines meet the outside, and it makes these really simple serrated teeth. And rather than mess with a hobby knife for this, I just pull out the scissors again and cut the vertical part, and then I'll cut the slanted part for the teeth. And yes, as awkward as this looks, this is the only way I could figure out how to hold it. And I didn't cut through all the way, just enough to get the majority of the markings cut through. The rest comes off really easily by hand. Now when you stack them like this, you get a really, really gnarly looking saw blade. Precisely what I'm after. Now one thing to note is that this first styrofoam ball was cut directly through the center, which was actually the wrong way to do it. I needed to account for the thickness of these plates stacked up, so the one that I ended up actually using is going to account for the thickness of those plates, so it looks circular all the way around. And now onto painting. The model's been primed completely with Citadel Chaos Black. The base was primed with the Army Painter terrain primer because it was raw styrofoam and I didn't want it eating away at it. It was glued with a big chunk of PVA because I needed a reliable glue, and using PVA glue made it almost look like a welded joint there. Now I'm using Pro Acryl Coal Black, a really good matte black. And the reason I'm using this over, say, Scale 75's black is because, at least in my experience, this dries a little more neatly. I mean, you need to experiment a little more, but the Pro Acryl Black is my favorite one currently. Now this is Pro Acryl Payne's Gray mixed in with a little bit of that black. And I'm using Payne's Gray because although it's called out as a gray, it has quite a bit of blue in it. You can see how it looks when I apply it to the miniature. Even though it's got some black in it to darken it down, it still reads quite a bit as a dark blue. A dark blue, but also a very cold blue. Very muted. And I want this model to read as having black armor, but I don't want to just use black. I want the black to have some interest and some depth, and I want the highlights to come up to something. And I'm using Payne's Gray for that. Now, funny coincidence, this Payne's Gray is from Pro Acryl's Artist Miniature line. This is one of Vince Venturella's colors from his set. Vince Venturella has a great video about making your black and your grays look more interesting. And one of the colors that he suggests you use is a Payne's Gray. So it's fitting that I'm using one of Vince's signature colors when that video helped me figure out a lot about how I wanted to paint black. So using Payne's Gray is one of those options. But you could probably do this with, you know, a really dark purple, or a red, or a green. I'm picking out some volumes. I'm not covering all of the black that I painted over. I'm sort of using the light as a guide. But not quite, because the light is fixed, and as I roll it around the miniature, the light's going to reflect in a few different ways, but I kind of pick one angle that I like, and I try to use that to help me pick out these volumes. So you can see how the light's hitting the model here on the forearm. I use that as my guide to figure out where to put these volumes. Not too concerned about accuracy, but I do follow the guide some. I thought about a few different ways to paint this model. My initial thought was to paint him just all red, starting with a very dark, deep red with no other color in it, just a really dark, like a blackish red, and then building up to a really bright red, just the entire thing, including the halo. But once I saw the art for the Sin Eater that Mike Francino had posted, I thought, no, I need this to be blackened armor, and I wanted it to look weathered. So it's also good practice for painting black, which I could always use some practice on. This engraved filigree on the leg was really fun to do. Not just for painting the black, but also for doing the weathering, which you'll see later on. So once I finished the first volumes with that darker Payne's Gray, I keep going back with the same mix except with more Payne's Gray added in. I guess you could say that's also Payne's Gray with less black added in. but much the same, trying to pick out the same volumes I painted before and painting less of the volume that's on there. Not looking for accuracy, I just want to break up the enormous black panels that are on here. But I look for important spots like the top of these embossed flowers, but also the upward face of that engraving just under the belly button there. Again, whatever the light picks up, it's a pretty good guide. I don't think it's going to steer me in the complete wrong direction. I'm really stoked for Trench Crusade because it hits on a lot of subject matter that I like, and in a really scary, twisted way, corrupted way. I can't wait to make more stuff for it. This is going to be the first in a long line of models I want to make for that game. These sections on the back of the neck look like they're supposed to be flexible, but I'm going to paint them the same as the black on the rest of the model. So this is just getting lighter and lighter. I went from Payne's Gray with black mixed into it all the way up to pure Payne's Gray. I also used Payne's Gray with a little bit of white mixed in just to line it up, and this will be for my absolute most extreme highlights. I kind of still ended up picking up a lot of big volumes with it, but using the light as a guide, it felt right at the time to do so. If it looks like I'm apprehensive in a few spots, that's because I kind of am. I'm analyzing what it is that I just painted and if I need to go further or if I should stop where I'm at. And although I said I'm not trying to paint accurately or super cleanly, I am still trying to strike a balance between giving more vibrancy to the black without losing the depth that I'm really after by making the armor black in the first place. Looking at it now, to my eyes, I achieved exactly what I wanted to do. So now the chipping. And here I really don't think you can go wrong. Go as far as you like. Right now this is a mix of scale 75s, black metal with a little bit of black mixed in. I didn't mix in the black to the black metal for the same reason that I mixed it into the Payne's Gray. With the Payne's Gray I wanted to start from a darker color and build up to a lighter color to create highlights. But for the metals, the reason I mixed in black is because I wanted to simulate different depths of chipping. So some of the chipping that didn't go as far into the armor, let's say, or as far past the, I don't know whether you want to call it black armor or whether you want to call it charred armor. For that kind of depth, I'm using a scale 75 mix with black. Now, a lot of it is focused on the edges, of course, because that's where the paint's going to chip first. But for the larger surface, I just stipple it on as randomly as I can. And there's all sorts of techniques for this. You can use a sponge. A torn up sponge is a very popular method for this. But rather than do that, I just grabbed a brush that I had just to be a little more measured with it. I put a little more chipping on the hands, for instance, because I figured that's where there's going to be a lot of wear. Because he is swinging around a melee weapon, after all, a lot of the edges are going to lose paint, so they've got to be chipped for sure. And the feet probably needed more chipping than I ended up giving it. But what's nice about doing weathering like this is that I can always add more. You know, for instance, if I'm taking this into a game, and in that game, let's say the Sin Eater tanks a artillery shell to the chest. Say it was a particularly memorable game, you know, he clutched it out for me or whatever. I could take that moment and immortalize it on the miniature. I could pick out a spot and focus a lot of weathering there, you know, streaking off of the shoulder or off of the chest to show where the impact was. I've mentioned this before, I don't really go back to work on models that I've already completed, but this model is supposed to break me out of that. I've been in this hobby for 18 years now, and never once have I gone back to something that I finished before or repurposed an old mini for something new. And I want to get in the habit of doing that, not just because it'll save money, but just because it forces me to be creative. You know, I was likely not going to play the Dark Souls board game ever again, but at least this way, Smo gets to live on, smashing his enemies to bits in a totally new setting. Now I'm using speed metal, and in some places I'm going over what I did before. In other places I'm just doing completely new patterns, completely new scratches, completely new chips. Again, I'm not necessarily looking to highlight what I did previously. A lot of it tended to look that way. It's more to give the impression that this guy's been doing this a long time. He's taken a beating from all sorts of weapons, large and small, and some of it will cause damage in different ways. So some of this battle damage is definitely fresher than the rest that might have had a little more time to darken a little bit from dirt and grime. Some of these scratches might have penetrated deeper than some of these other ones. That's kind of what the lighter metal is supposed to give the appearance of. Now onto the rust. This here is orange leather from scale 75, and I've watered it down quite a bit. You might say a glaze consistency, it's really too thin to be a really good layer, but I've watered it down because I want it to work its way into the cavities real easily, so it just kind of flows in there once I touch the brush of the model, but also because I'd like to be able to move it around some once I've placed it. And this is how I mainly do rust. And if you've got a way that you like to do rust and doing it this way doesn't really interest you, maybe you use the dirty down rust effects, or there's a certain paint or enamel or oil wash that you like, you could probably skip this whole part here. It's going to be a big part, so you can skip a lot of the video. The main reason I've been doing it like this for a long time is because it doesn't require any kind of solvents or particular washes or products that are kind of outside regular old acrylic paints. A big reason is just because I'm lazy and I haven't managed to go out and buy any of those products. But if you're a new painter, for instance, you know, maybe you don't want to invest in all sorts of effects. You want to wait a little bit before you do. You can get really, really good effects just by watering down like a really orangish brown. I'm using scale 75 orange leather, but there's a couple other orangish browns you could use. A popular one would be Scrag Brown from Citadel. Now, as it's drying, you can see how more of the paint settled in some spots, so it's giving a heavier rust effect. And you can just keep building that up as much as you want, keep adding more and more. Just like with the weathering I did using the metallic paints, it's kind of a matter of telling a story of how many battles this character has been in, or any particular tough encounters he's had. Rust also tells a story on its own. You know, the more and more rust that's accumulated on him, the longer he's been standing outside in the rain or trudging through the mud, plunging headfirst into the trenches, standing vigil in front of a cathedral or a chapel. You know, like I said, there's really no limit to how much rust you want to add to this model or how much weathering you want to add to it. I got to a point where I was happy with it, but if at some point I look at it and say, let's go a little more, then I totally can. Now, I did try to put a little bit of thought about where I was applying this rust, because there's all sorts of places that it could settle, all this model, but there are some spots where I don't think it would, like on flexible joints. Parts of the forearms, you know, those aren't flexible, but I briefly had a thought there, and I thought, you know, it can go on the back of the hand, but it probably shouldn't go between the fingers because they're constantly moving. Moisture probably doesn't settle in there as easily, so I left it off for now. Maybe at some point I'll add it if I think differently. But now, the feet, for instance, I did put some rust there, but that's because I figure the foot armor is just that, like a shoe, as opposed to those shoes that were really popular a few years back where, you know, you could walk like you're barefoot and move your individual toes. Yeah, I'm not sure this is that kind of armor. Maybe it is. The more I look at it, the more I realize that I'm essentially painting orange and blue, just kind of maybe rotated a little bit on the value scale. And orange and blue is such a classic combination anyway. It's funny to me how this worked out, that I still got some form of orange and blue on this model. And I'm really sorry about the focus. I promise it'll go back to normal, but that's one of the problems that I'm hoping to have figured out soon. So here I pulled out some red leather just because I wanted to get a different color in the recesses. And this could be like clay or silt or whatever, mud settling in the recesses some. I hadn't thought about this too much. I just saw the color there and I thought, yeah, I want to try and see how this looks. I didn't use as much of this as I did the orange leather. Just a couple spots that I thought might look good to break up the previous colors. I did like the result, so I'll probably use it in the future again. And now the halo, painted in Necro Gold, which is one of those paints that I'm just trying to find every excuse to use in my minis. Scale 75 really knocked it out of the park with this one. I thought about putting like a patina or some kind of weathering on the halo, but I liked it the way it turned out like this, kind of a pure gold. Almost like a symbol bestowed upon a creature even as hideous as this. Something still recognizably holy, but still unsettling because of who wields it. And I realize now I didn't record how I made this halo. To put it simply, I just used fluorescent wire wrapped around a round object, and then I cut it carefully. Upcoming video will have a more detailed explanation, but it's literally just fluorescent wire. I'm trying to be as gentle as I can with it so I don't bend it out of shape. But yeah, simple as that. This is a new Pro Acrylic color, dark bronze, mixed with a little bit of black, and it's interesting what that coal black does to a metallic color like this. Yes, it darkens it, but it also takes away a lot of the luster. And I'm sure a lot of that is because, you know, you're breaking up how much metallic medium you have in any given amount of paint. But the way it's flattened down, it really gives the impression of an older metal, of a very used metal that's lost its luster. So that's an effect that I think I want to experiment with more in the future, mixing a matte color or a matte medium even into a metallic color and seeing both finishes try to kind of fight for dominance on this thing. Now I put a little more work into the weapon in a different way that I didn't do on the metallics, on the body really. This is pure dark bronze, and if you look at the line of light that's coming down the shaft of the weapon, I'm basically just following that as best as I can with lighter and lighter metallics to give a big fat highlight all the way down. You know, sometimes when I paint models with a lot of metallics, all the metal, even if they're all metals of different colors, all the metal can make the model look really tonal, kind of boring in how shiny it is. So I approached this differently than I did the metal chipping on the Sin Eater himself. And that's why I'm layering this in such a way to where I'm focusing on that line of highlight. And although I rotate the model and the highlight moves, I kind of try to keep it in the same general area. So now I'm mixing in Dwarven Gold from scale 75 into these colors, and slightly smaller highlight as I work this in. You could really see it here, how rich the one color is in one section compared to the rest as it rolls around. And this is pure Dwarven Gold. So now on the mallet head, and again I apologize for the focusing issues, but on the head of this mace, I'm using the black metal that I had originally, and I'm mixing some heavy metal into it. And as with the shaft of the weapon, I'm using the light kind of as a guide, so you can see how On the weapon, it was a linear highlight down the length of the shaft. On the head of the hammer, it's more of a spherical light, a ball light. I'm not exactly sure how it's referred to, maybe like a spotlight. But I'm kind of seeing where it lands, and I'm exaggerating it on the hammerhead using these metals and the lighter and lighter metals that I keep adding to it. And again, it's just a case of mixing in more heavy metal into the black metal until I'm using pure heavy metal. Now, along these serrated teeth, I kind of was rough with it. I wasn't too worried about getting it exactly right, making a perfect highlight. Part of the reason was because, assuming this weapon spins, I don't really know if I thought about it spinning in any way, but I'd want there to be some wear along the teeth that kind of indicates that it spins, so it should all be traveling in the same direction along with the teeth. It's really rough, and I think in the end, I'm not entirely sure that I sold the effect, but I'm still pretty pleased with how it looked. And applying the metal like this, it gives the impression that also this weapon has been beaten with or beaten into. Not very smooth, definitely rougher. This is another one of those new Pro Acryl colors. This is green oxide. And although I thinned it down at first, I found that it had a little more body than I anticipated, so I just came back with a clean brush and tried to move it around some. And this is one of Ben Comet's signature colors. I was watching one of his videos, and he was talking to somebody who was off camera, and one of the things he said was so profound to me in its simplicity. And I find myself still saying that to this day to other painters that I paint with on Monday nights. No, he was painting something, and then he went back and painted over it because he felt like he made a mistake. And he said, you know, when that happens, just remind yourself, it's just paint. Just paint over it. It'll be fine. That's essentially what that meant to me. So I went over everything I did with a watered down green oxide, again because I like the matting effect, but the work I did with the previous metals to highlight it still shows through. This is just a nice overall patina on the metal. You see I'm wiping a lot of it away. That's because I'm just adding a lot of it and removing what doesn't feel right. As long as I do it quickly, I can modulate exactly how much patina I'm adding to the staff, or to the handle rather. So now I had these pits in the styrofoam ball, and that comes from the way the styrofoam is made. I'm no expert in how styrofoam is made, but from what I can tell, these are essentially millions of tiny balls that are just compressed together. On extruded polystyrene, it's so dense that it's not really an issue, but on this cheaper styrofoam, you know, you occasionally get these cracks. And I never made any plans to fill it in because I didn't really want to manipulate it and potentially damage it and move it out of shape. Now, but when I got to this stage, I realized I could make it look like the weapon has been pitted by all that rust that it's taken in. So now painting the face, and the first thing I laid down is some pink flesh from scale 75. And I do a couple coats of these, and this is purely a base coat because I figure I had a couple layers of pink flesh, and then when I get to the pale skin that I really want this color to be, I'll be adding less and less layers, and I won't lose any detail from how many layers I had to apply. So now this is that pale skin I was talking about. The idea here was that I would paint the face to look like a porcelain cherub. Growing up, in a Hispanic household and visiting all my aunts and uncles, there was a lot of cherub-esque imagery in those homes, and definitely always struck me as a little creepy, so I figured I'd try to apply some of that here. And so I wanted a porcelain face, and at a lot of cherub art shows, rosy cheeks, bright pink lips. So I'm glazing that on some because I don't want it to be too strong with the pink flesh I used before, but I definitely wanted the hint of color to be there. And you can see the expression now. It's a pretty somber expression, which to me only makes him even more terrifying. I mean, imagine seeing this hulking monster chasing you down and you have nowhere to go. He doesn't even look mad or upset or anguished. He looks peaceful, almost regretful. It's gotta be horrifying to face. Now, using brown leather and a very tiny brush, I'm trying to paint in some of these facial features. And the thing about these porcelain figures, as I'm sure you've perhaps seen in the past, I wanted this to look like it was painted on, as if they were painting on to a porcelain figure. So not super detailed, essentially only using the brown to paint the eyebrows and the eyes. And I really wanted that to come across on this face, which is why I'm not painting in, all the parts of the eye, just the suggestion of a painted on one. And then I had the idea that since the face is porcelain and surely this dude's been through a lot of battles, let's paint some cracks. Someone scored a lucky hit and nailed him in the face, and then probably got turned to paste immediately after. I've zoomed in quite a bit on the footage, and I know it looks terrible, but, it's just to kind of show you what I was doing. It's not really supposed to be how an actual workflow goes. Zooming in this much, I don't use any kind of magnification when I paint. So I painted cracks on both sides of the face, and the other side of the face that has the bigger crack, I also punched out the eye. And now working on the skulls, I base coat these with brown leather because I had it on hand. Also, a quick note while we're here, if you take a look at the head of the hammer, you can see that I have what looks like a pretty smooth transition between right where the rust is laying. I have a pretty smooth transition between the saw blades and the actual spherical portion of the hammer. I used PVA and just kind of worked it in and smoothed it out to try to cover up any gaps because, believe me, during assembly, the gaps in there were huge. But PVA helped to cover it all up, and then once it's painted over, you don't even know that the gaps are there. For the skulls, I've been adding Thar brown progressively until I get to a pure Thar brown. And although it looks like I'm trying to layer it, I am actually trying to texture it too. So I don't thin this down too much because I want to build some texture and build some pigment on the skulls to make them look like they've got some graininess to them. And I just keep building more and more and more with additional Thar brown. The last color I use is Mojave White. It's not too big a step from the previous one I used, and the reason it looks like that is because lighter colors like whites and yellows tend to have less coverage because there's less of that pigment within the paint. So I go back a couple times and build it up more and more and more until I get the lightness that I'm looking for. Now in the artwork for the Sin Eater itself is covered in gore, and I would like to add that someday, but because I didn't really have a good reliable way to apply it to a model, I didn't want to throw it on here without getting a really cool effect that I know would really read as gore. So once I figure that out, I'll add it to this and I'll share it on social media. But for now, this definitely checks all the boxes of what I wanted out of a miniature that elicits just horror and uneasiness and is intimidating on the tabletop. If I can put this down on the table and make the opponent second guess attacking it because they fear what might happen, then I'll be very, very pleased. And here it is, my completed Sin Eater. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and especially reviving an old miniature I used to love and bringing new life into it. I hope this inspires you to do the same. Dig up an old miniature and make something new out of it. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you in the next one. Happy painting, y'all.